May only your word be spoken, O Lord. May only your word be heard. Amen.
Amen.
Please be seated. And good morning, and I'm glad to be here. Brad Sullivan, the vicar at Lord of the Streets Episcopal Church, and we'll get to tell you a little bit about Lord of the Streets in a little bit. But first, a sermon. In the movie Flight, Denzel Washington plays an airline pilot who made a miraculous landing of a crippled aircraft that should have crashed, and he was able to save all but 3 people on board. Those 3 people were out of their seatbelts and got tousled around as the plane was in the midst of crashing. So he was a hero, except that he was also drunk and high on coke while he was flying. Throughout the movie, no one knew this, except for his lawyers later. Throughout the movie, he's heralded as a hero, which he certainly was. And there was an investigation into the flight, which there certainly should have been. And throughout, he's hiding the fact that he was drunk and high during the flight, and he ends up spiraling further and further into alcoholism. And he fought this truth because in his mind, it didn't matter that he was drunk and high. He landed that plane. No one else could have done what he did. So it should have remained hidden. It didn't matter. He was a hero. He should be lauded as a hero. He should be exalted as a hero. And at the same time, he was thoroughly miserable and pretty much seemed to hate himself and everyone around him. So the investigation turned up missing vodka from the plane, which he had drunk, and his team of lawyers decides that one of the flight attendants who had died while saving a little boy and getting his seatbelt on, that's why she had died, well, they should pin the vodka on her, say that she had drunk it. No one could prove it wrong. All Denzel had to do was to lie, to agree to that story, and he could have gotten off scot-free and be exalted by everyone as a hero. Finally realizes that he couldn't do it, can't lie about this flight attendant who had herself saved this other passenger. So he finally admitted to being drunk and high while flying and ended up in prison over the whole thing, lost his pilot's license, no more flying, no more career, no more being a hero in people's eyes. But rather than being miserable, sitting in prison, he ended up sober and happy and glad that he had finally admitted what was going on and said that for the first time in his life, even though in prison, he was finally free. You even see a couple of cards and photos of people that he had cared about before and who cared about him, that he had run off, that were now back and in his corner and supporting him, waiting for him to get out. Humble yourselves, Peter wrote. Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that in due time he may exalt you. Until the end of the movie, Denzel Washington's character was seen as a hero. He was heralded by all, but he was down in the dirt low. He was miserable, he was angry, he was scared, and he resented everyone and everything around him. Then he humbled himself by admitting the truth, and finally he was exalted. He was in prison, but he was exalted because he was finally joyous and free. Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, so that in due time he may exalt you. So let's look at what this passage obviously doesn't mean. If you talk about yourself really, really badly, and you think of yourself really, really badly, then God will make you ruler of everything. Obviously not. Humble yourself and you'll be exalted. Being humble does not mean thinking badly of yourself or talking badly about yourself. And being exalted by God does not mean becoming the best, most important person ever. True humility means seeing ourselves as we truly are. accepting who we truly are. If we're great at stuff, we get to admit that. When we're not really good at stuff and are actually pretty terrible at some things, we get to admit that too. We look deep within ourselves. We admit our faults. We admit where we've hurt and harmed others. We admit where we've been fantastic. We look at ourselves with deep honesty. That's humility. Now, part of humility is when we hurt others. There's another part of humility about when others have hurt us. Peter talks about this in his letter, being hurt unjustly by others. Humbling ourselves in this case means accepting ourselves as we truly are, not as the other person sees us. So when we're being hurt and rejected and scorned by others, humility is realizing, I was going to say something else, they're wrong. We'll just go with they're wrong. Then humility is also letting resentment go towards them so that we don't end up with their stupidity, anger, hatred, whatever, infecting ourselves. Cast all your anxieties upon God, for he cares about you, Peter wrote. Letting go of the anger that we have, the fear that we have, is an act of humility. Letting go of our anger and our fear when we are hurt unjustly gives God something to work with, to help heal us. When we're not just full of anger right back at them, but we can let that go, then God can work with us to heal us. Even when we've been harmed, we can seek humility to open ourselves up to God's healing. But what about when we've been the ones doing the harm, when we've hurt others? Well, humility is admitting the fact that we've hurt them, and then looking at why we hurt them. What was going on inside of us? Maybe it's because they hurt us first and they deserved whatever they got. And maybe they really did. Maybe we were scared or anxious or fearful. Again, humbly looking deeply at the truth within us, we then give God something to work with so that God can then start to exalt us. So, all right, then what does exalted mean? Well, again, I talked about the character in the movie being exalted by being in prison, but also by being finally joyous and free. I said that being exalted does not mean becoming the best, most important person ever. In this life, being exalted is not about being raised above others. Being exalted is about being raised up out of our misery and fear. Being exalted means being able to love who we are, warts and all. Being exalted means trusting in God and trusting that God cares about us. Being exalted means casting our anxieties upon God rather than lashing out at others because of our anxieties or self-soothing in destructive ways. Calm and peace and acceptance, that's what being exalted by God looks like. Freedom from the bondage of hatred and resentment towards those who harm us unjustly, that's what being exalted by God looks like. Even when enemies like society at large or our own government are the ones who harm us unjustly, Peter says rejoice, which seems weird. Rejoice, Peter says, insofar as you are sharing Christ's sufferings, so that you may also be glad and shout for joy when his glory is revealed. So rejoicing can look like calm and peace and acceptance and letting go of hatred and resentment. Rejoicing can look like casting our anxieties upon God. Who's God? Rejoicing can look like trusting that all will not be as we want it to be. Rejoicing can be trusting that all will not be what we want it to be in this life, but trusting that there is a new life after death, in which God does grant us the love and the delight and the exaltation we deserve. At the same time, rejoicing does get to be mingled with sorrow. Admitting the fact that we are still hurting and afraid is part of humility, is part of being exalted, is part of rejoicing. Rejoicing, exaltation, and humility don't mean be a doormat. Rejoicing when suffering unjustly does not mean keep going, I'm good. When being unjustly oppressed by others, rejoicing means striving for justice. Joining with others to stand up to oppressors, but doing so with love rather than with hatred. Rejoicing doesn't mean denying hurt or pretending all is well when all is not well. Doing so is the exact opposite of humility, pretending or lying to ourselves and everyone else around us. That's what Denzel Washington's character did in the movie Flight. Humility is honesty with ourselves, honesty with others, honesty with God. Humility can be honesty with society at large. Humility can grant us peace, can grant us freedom from bondage, and that is God's exaltation of us. Freedom from hatred and fear, freedom from self-loathing, freedom from anxiety and misery. Rejoicing even in the midst of suffering is calm, peace, acceptance, and freedom. Rejoicing is still sometimes mingled with sorrow, but rejoicing is trusting in God. Even though all is not right and will not be right in this life, all will not be as it should be in this life, we rejoice because all shall be well. Whether in this life or the next, we rejoice because all shall be well. We rejoice with the exaltation of calm and peace and acceptance. We rejoice with the freedom from resentment. We rejoice with the ability to strive for justice, with love. We rejoice by humbling ourselves under the mighty hand of God and casting our anxieties upon Him, for He cares about us.